It's time to talk about magical realism on Mars and what I don't understand. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just any books. We'll be talking about Desolation Road by Ian McDonald today. His first novel came out in 1988, and as promised, I'll be going through all the Ian McDonald books I own in publication order, sort of, with the ones that I've already read pushed in between, and this is the first one, so welcome. Let's do this together. We'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick synopsis on why you should read it, and then we'll talk in some detail about some spoilery elements and some stylistic elements and all the other stuff that I think makes this book so fantastic. But before we move on, this one goes out to one of my new Patreon backers. I'm really happy you're here. Chadia, this one's for you. Cheers. Now, if you want a personal cheers, there is a Patreon. You're not obliged to do anything here. I'm just mentioning it. Anyway, let's move on and talk about Desolation Road, what it is, what it isn't, why you should go and read it, if you can find it. Those books are sometimes hard to find, which is a big shame. Anyway, what is Desolation Road? I already just said it's magical realism on Mars. I'll go into what that means later on. So what it is the story of the town of Desolation Road, the people that live there, and how it becomes really, really important and then vanishes. It's a generational story. The town is very clearly part of the, well, maybe even the main character, and it follows different families in several generations, what those people do, how they impact the lives of everyone on this world. And it is science fiction. It is technically set on Mars, but it uses the language of, well, magical realism, of irony, of the postmodern, and a lot of other elements and bits and pieces to tell a story that sometimes feels like a Western, that sometimes feels like a political satire that moves around and oscillates between different genres and subgenres. Each of these individual plot lines sometimes feel like individual short stories that are sort of woven together into a big tapestry, which is a symbol that may come up later, and build this whole story around it. It is very different from anything that you may have read in fantasy or science fiction in that regard. It is funny, it is deeply moving, it brings elements in that you may not have thought of in any way, shape, or form. And at the end of the day, it's just a very, very interesting, powerful thing if you want to see what is possible within the framework of science fiction, if we kind of ignore genre boundaries and if we kind of ignore conventions that have sort of been ingrained over the decades and centuries. Simply for that, I recommend you read it. It's going to be like nothing you've read before, most likely. It could possibly remind you from time to time of authors that have come after and have been influenced by Ian McDonald. But yeah, if you want to try something really unique, I highly recommend you try this if you can find it somewhere. It is going to be one of the weirdest things, one of the funniest things, one of the most interesting things yet you can read within the genre of science fiction. That alone should be reason enough to try it out. It will definitely stay with you in one way or another. And yeah, so go read it, and let's talk about all the wonderful things that I think make this book so unique and that make this book so powerful in what it does. But from here on out, there will be spoilers. So while I have a bit of beer, you go and read a thing. It's not that long. I mean, it's like 400 something pages. Those of you who have read epic fantasy can do this in like one afternoon, right? And we're back. Let's be talking about spoilerishy things, unlike why I think this book is so brilliant. And let's start with the first part, the magical realism part. Now, here's the thing. Magical realism is certainly one of those terms that has been thrown around a lot, and no one really knows what it means and so forth. So I'll try to explain how I think magical realism does apply to this specific novel. Now, I would call magical realism in the largest way not so much a genre as a specific literary tradition that is mostly rooted in Latin America, but not only there, but it has sort of built its school there with our authors talking to each other, responding to each other in their novels and so forth. And it certainly has left its mark on Desolation Road. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, obviously, people have compared Desolation Road to 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I have read that book recently, and I can see the comparison, and there are certainly very clear influences from 100 Years of Solitude on Desolation Road. You have a town in the middle of nowhere that is not really supposed to be there, that begins, that is founded, and then vanishes at the end of the story, and we follow these different families and how they sort of impact the larger surroundings and so forth. Those parallels are here, but I think it's a bit too short a step to say this is why it feels like magical realism, just because it has a similar structure to 100 Years of Solitude and has some very specific and explicit references to the other book. I think the main thing that makes Desolation Road feel like magical realism is one very specific stylistic thing or structural thing that Ian McDonald does here, and that is metaphors are real. And that's something we can see also with something like 100 Years of Solitude. We can also see it with some of the books that someone like Salman Rushdie writes, who calls himself a writer of magical realism. And that is, once again, metaphors are real. A lot of books employ metaphors. We all use metaphors and similes all the time when we talk, when we write books and so forth. But within magical realism, things that are considered basically metaphors otherwise are suddenly real. And they are not questions. These magical aspects that we, use as phrases in our everyday life. Someone has a mythical mind. Someone has a rational mind. Things like that are real. When McDonald says that the Mandela family has this curse where always one child has the curse of rationalism and one has the curse of mysticism, that has very explicit, real consequences. Whereas if we talk about someone being a bit of a mystically minded person, we usually just mean something less literal. Like metaphors are literally true in this specific novel, and that gives it very clearly that mystical, that magical realist feel in a lot of ways. And it is an underlying logic of the universe of Desolation Road, which allows McDonald's to do a lot of interesting things later on. We'll talk about that when we get to the larger part of what you might call themes within this story. But I think that's where a lot of the idea of magical realism comes from. And of course, language-wise, he chooses words that give it a sort of more magical, more archaic sort of feel, which is the next thing that I think we need to talk about. The terms he uses, the vocabulary he uses. This is technically science fiction. So there are machines, we find that out very early on. There's classic science fiction and science fantasy-ish terminology. And I would say the key here is that it's a more archaic vocabulary. A lot of the language that is used for machines and stuff that happens in this world, like when it comes to the science fiction vocabulary, the sciencey vocabulary, feels more like 1930s, 1940s pulp era science fiction vocabulary. We have those solar gliders and stuff like that. Nothing is really explained in much detail in that regard. And it feels much more like, say, Jack Vance. I would detect, next to, say, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I would definitely say there is a lot of Jack Vance in this, also in the ironic detachment from a lot of stuff that is happening in this world. It feels very Vancian in that regard, and I think that's one important aspect. It feels older or more archaic in that regard. This also comes up when we talk about names. Mars is never named Mars in this book, except for like the last page or two when it says like the story of the town of Desolation Road on Mars. It's called Ares. And other planets are also used by Greek names. Obviously, the fact that the West has named all these planets after Roman gods allows Ian McDonald to just take their Greek equivalents, because a lot of Roman gods do have Greek equivalents. So Venus is now Aphrodite, and Mercury is Hermes, and so forth. So we have these, we have these very specific shifts in language that makes it sound slightly more archaic, and because we always think of archaic as more magical or more occult or whatever, because we live in a rational age, right? It gives it this more magical feel by simply just like shifting names in that direction. The same is with like towns on Ares, Mars, that is only always called Earth in this world. Anyway, that we have places called Deuteronomy, which is Old Testament. It's not New Testament. So this shift in language to an older age gives it this more magical feeling, I think. And a lot of other stuff is also sort of set in the past, which is the next part where we can get like themes, or not themes, but like elements for the setting from that I think that have had an impact on the style of the novel, of the way the novel is told and the way it deals with things. That is, of course, the Old West. Now, Westerns are a big thing. Everyone is reading Lonesome Dove at the moment. But McDonald is dealing with a different form of Western, the mythical Old West in a lot of ways. The not very gritty, brutal, Blood Meridian type of Western, but the romantic mythological way of the small town in the West, where sometimes maybe one or two bad black hats are coming in that you can always recognize because they are wearing black hats and so forth. And Desolation Road does have feelings of that in a lot of ways. It's next to a train track, and for whatever reason, they may be nuclear powered, but they're still apparently steam engines. We have nuclear-powered steam trains in this world, which is really interesting. We have people come by that feel like the typical hustlers and snake oil salesmen that we kind of know from the West, right? We have Adam Black's traveling Chautauqua and Speranza, scientific Speranza, a wonderful idea of someone coming to town and showing people the mysteries of the universe. The way that you have like the traveling Romani in 100 Years of Solitude, but also that you have in all kinds of old Western, mythical Old West, you have these people, these traveling wonder circuses and stuff like that, carnivals in a lot of ways. We have these elements in this specific world, in Desolation Road, that allow McDonald to pull on those images that we all have from the mythical West. And once again, myths are important in this kind of world in the way that Ian McDonald tells stories in general. We will come back to that in different books further down the line. And Desolation Road lays the foundation for that. Another key and mythical time is, of course, the 1930s and especially 1940s and early 1950s in American history. This book, I feel, has much more influence from an American background compared to like the more like Irish, Northern Irish background that comes up in other McDonald novels. So and that is, of course, the late 30s, the New Deal times, the World War II, and the beginning of the 1950s in a lot of ways. And this is symbolized with the next big part, which is all the swing music for whatever reasons. Glenn Miller and his band being a big part of this. And once again, these have been put into what you might call an American mythology, ongoing mythology in a lot of ways. Glenn Miller and his band playing for the army, then vanishing on their flight, dying in a plane crash, basically. It's something that you can also see in, say, Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, where Glenn Miller also shows up quickly for a moment. So having these elements pulled in here as well allow McDonald's to pull on another full important part of like weird, mixed and foreshortened, anachronistic sort of American mythology that as history has turned into the whole swing and jazz part, the crime that is associated with that, the organized crime that is associated with that. We have obviously Mr. Jericho is part of some form of organized crime syndicate in that regard. We have all of these elements that also add this mythic tone to the world that sort of make the whole thing feel sort of set slightly out of time, which is obviously what happens literally when Dr. Alimentando uses his time machine to save Desolation Road. It's this place sort of out of time in this mythic time compared to secular time, if you want to use philosophical language that people like Charles Taylor employ these days. So that's the next important part that gives its very own and unique feel there. Once again, there are bits and pieces that are just metaphors made real. One of the big parts here being, of course, the Hand, the episode with the Hand, which is absolutely fantastic and one of the weirdest and best things of the novel, when the Hand, who is this incredible guitar player, comes and tells his story and at the end uses the guitar to sing down the rain. Now, the idea of singing down the rain is obviously something that we know from mythology in different places. There's rain dances and rain songs and so forth in different societies that have a magical tradition. But here we have someone who plays an electric guitar and sings the literal song, the true name of the song of the rain, to bring the rain finally to Desolation Road. And the way he does that near the first Viking lander, and the way the Viking lander is traveler from the northern fjords, and that's the Viking lander, which was one of the first space probes sent to Mars, and that's the heart of the desert. So we have these tiebacks to what we can recognize is old Earth at the end of the day, which is called the old home and so forth. And they are also shrouded in the language of mythology, in the language of myth and archaic terminologies. And he plays the Song of the Rain. And you have this long passage that it's just the song of like different parts of the rain in beautiful poetry, literally really well done poetry, and that brings down the rain. It's a wonderful, wonderful story in its own, but I think it's a great example to see how what I mean when I talk about like how metaphors are made real. And how they are, and this is the important part, loaded with modern mythologies, because there's the backstory of the hand being the king of this one space habitat, the king of McCartney Station, and he fights the king of he's the king of Karaoke Station, and he fights the king of McCartney Station, and they have these guitar battles, and it's all the weird mythology of 80s rock and metal kind of built into that. So if you ever go and look at Broker's Helm albums and song lyrics where they talk about riding on dragons and killing people with death tones played on their guitars, that's that kind of mythology built in, and now it's made real within the story words, and it's what I would call the magical realist aspect of it. It's making the magical real within this specific world. Now let's talk about the next important part, and that is the tone of irony, and then we talk about themes and stuff. As I said, there is a very specific level of irony in here that we can find in some of the more modern, like postmodern authors in American literature. Someone like Thomas Pynchon definitely comes to mind in here, others as well. We also find it in the slight detachment that we have with some of like definitely Jack Vance, definitely some Fritz Leiber from time to time, Fritz Leiber from time to time. It is in here as well. We also have that in, at least the English translation, I don't speak Spanish, so I don't know, of something like 100 Years of Solitude. There's also always a slight distance, ironic distance between the narrator and the characters. And that allows McDonald to make jokes that sort of break the fourth wall in some regards, that allow him to build a sort of like humorous, good-humored sort of look at what is happening and describe the most horrendous things with some quite acerbic side comment there, without getting bogged down and the whole thing becoming too preachy. It's a very fine art, but I think he pulls it off a lot, and we can see that with some language comments, some wonderful weird similes, like they were as alike as peas in a pod and days in a prison, which is like, wow, that kind of stuff. It also allows him to make comparisons that are really weird and fascinating, right? Or pull in words. We have this long list of people that the next one whose name I keep constantly forgetting, his son, who becomes the greatest snooker player in the world and fights a snooker duel against the devil and wins, which is once again one of those very classic Old West mythologies, on the one hand, of having like a gunfight or card game against the devil. Here it's pool, because we have shifted to the 1940s speakeasies and whatever. That's still like 1920s, 1930s, but we have shifted to the age of swing, or the mythology of swing in that regard. We have that duel against the devil, but before that we have this long list of people that got defeated, and among those are some really funny names, including Norman Mailer and Harlan Ellison, and that's obviously Harlan Ellison and Norman Mailer, who are, well, very specific authors of the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and so forth. And it's just funny to see those bits in here. If you don't recognize them, that's totally fine. It's just like a long list of funny sounding names, and they're just like thrown in there in the middle. And that's the level of irony, and that allows him to break the fourth wall with having these jokes and references in that you don't necessarily need, or having Saint Cathy, and we will talk about Saint Cathy in a moment again, having those bits and pieces sort of float in. It allows him also to talk about stuff later on, some heavy stuff when it comes to revolution, when it comes to capitalism, when it comes to all these bits and pieces that we need to talk about. And that's the next part that irony allows Ian McDonald to pull off here. It allows for that level of humor that is sort of constantly bubbling in the background, because isn't it always just kind of funny to see how ridiculous we as humans are? And it makes you laugh, because you have to kind of laugh and smile, because otherwise you're going to break down and cry, because there's no middle ground here in a lot of ways. So let's move on and talk about the next big thing, which is a lot of these mythical things that McDonald's pulls off are about inverting meaning, or standing it on its head, which, for example, means that where Glenn Miller and his band in our world are obviously were obviously making music for the armed forces, the Allied forces during World War II. They are on the good guys' side. In this world, on Ari's, they are, however, tied to the whole Earth Army and the rebels of Swing who take over stations to pirates and out the Swing and everything. Switching sort of these meanings of systemic or the old system being supported by this kind of music, switching it into the 1960s rock and roll kind of feeling in that regard. We switch meanings by inverting them in a lot of ways. We have that in several instances throughout the story. Which allow us to do these things, right? When we switch on to industrial feudalism, we'll talk about that in a second, right? Industrial feudalism basically being capitalism, and in a lot of ways, capitalism is feudalism, and we talk about these kind of ideas nowadays in a lot of ways in political discourse, but by never ever calling it capitalism, but basically showing capitalism that has been seen or was seen as the next thing, a revolutionary force in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, all the way to now. And it still likes to cast itself as this new thing, but instead calling it industrial feudalism. It once again, by sort of like inverting the meaning, shows its clear underlying structure, and that's a big thing that we see throughout the novel again and again. So we'll talk about like the three main things that bring the whole story to its like close, and these are obviously the fights against the three forces, these being industrial feudalism through the Bethlehem Aries Corporation and Johnny Starling in that regard, and Michael Margolis. We talk about the Whole Earth Army and Arnie Tenebrae, and we talk about the political forces of Maya Quinsana, the official party. And this once again is interesting because it's kind of difficult to give those two political forces real-world equivalents. In a lot of ways, the party is fascist. It uses fascist rhetoric in a lot of ways. But it's also populist in a more leftist way because it's just the party and so forth. In other ways, the Whole Earth Army is a terrorist insurgency in a lot of ways, but it's also for the whole, Mars not having migrants in there, which is right-wing in a lot of ways. So we have these mixed feelings between those like different forces, one of like state populism, authoritarianism in the one hand, and a radical terrorist insurgency. And it kind of shows that when we're looking at these structures, the underlying political ideology is not necessarily that meaningful. The same with the industrial feudalism and the corporation, which is obviously capitalism under this different terminology. But, and this is when all these three forces collide in Desolation Road at the end of the day, what it is about is individual ambition, and I think this is at the core of the story, and we'll get to that. There are structures that allow us to be to gain important power, to abuse power, and wreak incredible harm all over the place. And this is something we see throughout the story. Harm usually happens when people follow their personal ambitions instead of doing something else. And these structures are ready for those ambitious people, right? The political system is there for Maya Quinsana to take over. The Whole Earth Army is there for Arnie Tenebrae to take over. And the Bethlehem Aries Corporation is there for Johnny Starling to take over when they feel that inner ambition to be more than they are, to take over power over other people. That's the point. The structures are there. The individuals may change. Those structures still remain. And once they do that, they wreak absolute havoc on the entire planet and almost destroy, the entire planet. And they definitely destroy Desolation Road. And this, I think, is if you want to find some clearer meaning within the entire story, which is obviously this tapestry of all kinds of individual ambition will bring harm to the larger community, whereas the core of Desolation Road is all these people that are stranded at this specific plot. And as long as everyone is living in community and basically just not giving into personal ambitions, larger personal ambitions, and working in like a mutual society, mutual help society in a lot of ways, everyone thrives together. So there is a clear opposition of individual ambition versus a communal society. What you might call like almost like an anarchist ideal in a lot of ways. And I think that's at the core of a lot of this is we build societies together, not by following our individual ambitions, whether it is to become the greatest snooker player in the world, whether it is to become a saint of Saint Cathy, of the Catherine's Wheel, or whether it is to take over the party, the whole Earth army, or the biggest corporation to do all of these things. And this is the fun thing, over time, those individuals once again get eked out by the system. I think this is the clearest in the Bethlehem Aries Corporation, where obviously Johnny Starling at the end gets replaced by a robot, because everyone gets replaced by robots because they do the machine of capitalism much better than we do, which is almost a cyberpunk metaphor right there. And this, I think, is the powerful thing. We have all these different metaphors, and through telling the story of a town, literally ending up with the first Mandela, Eva Mandela, putting the story into a tapestry, weaving the story as a tapestry, is making this whole message of it's it takes a village, not just individuals, making this very literal. And once again, this is magical realism. So we take metaphors and make them real within the story world. And this is powerful stuff. So yeah, there is obviously another bunch of things that I found interesting, which is all these other piled in references. We start with Dr. Alimantando follows the green person over the desert, which may or may not be a Stephen King reference. Obviously, the Gunslinger, the Dark Tower, has this weird Western science fiction feel. So having that opening, I think, is probably deliberate as a joke reference. On the other hand, green persons that are time travelers, we know from the Book of the New Sun, and we know that Ian McDonald has loved the Book of the New Sun, so that may be a reference. We have three-legged monster machines that are killer robots. We've all seen War of the Worlds, or all these other three-legged monsters from Mars. Day of the Tripods, and there's all these different versions of that. So we have all these elements in here that are references. And once again, having Catherine being the saint of the torturers, being a saint here, being like the main saint here, I think is another one of these elements. Obviously, her being, riding a Lincoln Town car and looking very 1950s rock and roll-y is just like really funny. And once again shows this other thing that it's mythology that we use, and we turn history into mythology, and mythology is the language that we use to tell these tales, and using these different parts of mostly Western, mostly American mythology to tell a story about Mars in the future that is about community versus individual ambition is a powerful move, and it's incredibly funny, and it's just so good. And that's all I have today about Desolation Road. I don't understand it. These are just my attempts of explaining what I thought about it. If you have read it, let me tell you, please tell me what you thought about it. There's a long list of comments down there, hopefully, by the time I come back. Maybe not, because no one has read the book. I hope you do. I hope you let me know what you think about it. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, please comment, share it with someone else. Get the book, read the book. That's the most important part. Join the Patreon if you want a personal shout out or other things. And yeah. I'll see you in the next one when we talk about possibly Out on Blue 6. And until then, thanks and cheers.